monthly seminar of SAFPAC. We run an critical existential analytics training program. We tend to try and look at phenomenology through existentialism, psychoanalysis, and critical perspectives. And in this term, we look at psychoanalysis. And delighted my colleague Rosie Rizq, who's Professor of Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy, is coming to explore a very apposite theme this evening. I'm somebody, I don't know if everyone would agree here, but I found, so to my surprise, from somebody who refused to work on the internet, on the telephone, with clients, really, that I've found a lot of benefits in working in this way. And I think in some ways it's been also benefits to my clients and patients. But I think it's too easy to start to forget what's been lost. And I can't think of anyone better than Rosie who start to explore this aspect with us about what is being lost. And so I'd like to hand over, before I hand over to Rosie, just to say that Rosie's going to, I think, talk, well, maybe a third of the time, just over, something like that. And then perhaps we just have a few questions and like to offer the possibility that we work briefly in some groups. We've got the technology with this stuff, so we could work in groups for a little bit and then come back for a plenary. So that's the suggestion. We'll see how you feel when we get there. So Rosie, over to you. What has been lost? Online melancholia.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Dal, and hello everyone. It's lovely to see you again, if only online, of course. E.M. Forster's dystopian novella, The Machine Stops, opens with a young man speaking to his mother through a device rather like a modern-day computer. Mother and son live on different sides of the planet, but they can each see an image of each other in a round plate before them. Their voices can be heard in real time. The young man is in a state of some distress. He wants to see his mother in person. He wants to speak to her not through the wearisome machine. The machine is much, he says, but it's not everything. I see something like you in this plate, but I don't see you. I hear something like you through this telephone, but I don't hear you. That's why I want you to come. Pay me a visit so we can meet face to face and talk about the hopes that are in my mind. His mother reminds him that live meetings between people are not permitted. Interaction can only take place via the machine. Her son, she thinks, looks sad when he hears this, but she could not be sure, writes Forster, for the machine did not transmit nuances of expression. It only gave a general idea of people, an idea that was good enough for all practical purposes. The imponderable bloom, declared by a discredited philosophy to be the actual essence of intercourse, was rightly ignored by the machine, just as the imponderable bloom of the grape was ignored by the manufacturers of artificial fruit. Something good enough had long since been accepted by our race. Now, the idea of an imponderable bloom that's ignored by the machine, I think, is something that really resonates for us all today. For as we negotiate the current coronavirus crisis, we found ourselves living in a world that bears a remarkable resemblance to Forster's dystopian vision. Counsellors, psychotherapists, and mental health practitioners of all kinds have been forced online, and there's been a rush to provide and develop services for all those who need it during the pandemic. Therapists, of course, have become increasingly familiar with the idea of digital therapeutics. At the end of last year, the NHS announced that over 300,000 patients in the UK were now using some form of digital therapy, ranging from CBT and psychoeducation to counselling, all involving various forms of online and video conferencing platforms. The numbers today are far higher, and of course, in the context of COVID, all of us are now expected, even required, to offer our services via Skype, Zoom, DoxyMe, or even WhatsApp. Given the uncertainty about the likely trajectory of this pandemic, it seems likely our online work will only increase. And indeed, NHS England is currently working with the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence to assess 14 different digital therapy products for future use in mental health services. By now, that number is far higher. And in the face of this rapid development and eager expansion of online platforms, I think it's far from clear what the future holds for face-to-face therapy. In this paper, I want to think of the changes that are occurring in the field of mental health as an example or microcosm, if you like, of the changes that are currently affecting all practitioners who work with people. And I want to say from the outset, following on from what Del said earlier, I've no doubt that for many of us, online work is quicker, it's more convenient, it's more flexible, and above all, it's more accessible. And it's demonstrated enormous advantages during a period of lockdown, where we've been able to continue working with those we would not otherwise be able to help. But given the abundant opportunities for online work and the rising numbers of clients clamoring for online therapy, perhaps it's all the more puzzling when we find ourselves feeling that something somewhere has gone missing. Indeed, in the torrent of online communication, it seems as if what Forster calls an imponderable bloom might be in danger of disappearing altogether. The imponderable, of course, is exactly that. It's something unfathomable, enigmatic, something that's difficult, if not impossible, to clearly define. We catch glimpses of it, perhaps, in the feelings of frustration and sadness that many practitioners seem to be experiencing at this time. Some of my colleagues and supervisees report feeling exhausted, overwhelmed, even resentful when faced with an unrelenting succession of virtual clients. A few have talked about quitting altogether. Clients too, although clearly relieved at the availability of online work, frequently express painful feelings of bewilderment and anxiety, like, my sessions aren't the same anymore. I know you're there, but I don't feel you in the same way. Or even in one particularly poignant moment, where are you? And this particular client was one who reached forward and put the palm of her hand against the computer screen and asked me to put my hand against the screen too, so that our hands were palm to palm. And I found her attempt to touch my hand, to feel my physical presence through the screen, really almost unbearably moving. We feel the loss of something, but it's difficult to know exactly what has gone astray. Freud tells us these feelings are characteristic of melancholia, something he discusses in his paper Mourning and Melancholia, which was written in 1917 against the backdrop of the First World War. Freud sees mourning as a normal response to loss and identifies melancholia as a failed or pathological attempt at mourning. The mourner, he suggests, is aware or conscious of what's been lost and recognizes the need to let go of the lost object. The melancholic, however, is unable to account for his feelings of sadness. One cannot see clearly what it is that has been lost, says Freud, and it's all the more reasonable to suppose that the patient cannot consciously perceive what he has lost either. Instead of withdrawing libido from the lost object, as in mourning, Freud tells us, the melancholic has withdrawn the lost object into himself where it's incorporated as a means of magically retaining it. The identification of the ego with the lost object thus ensures the loss is not eradicated, but continues its existence as an inner presence, a hidden, ungrievable loss that's been withdrawn from consciousness. Indeed, by identifying so fully with the lost object, the melancholic fails to recognize that she's lost anything at all. I think we too are in danger of failing to recognize that we may have lost something in the welter of online services and the plethora of digital technologies that are currently available. And I want to try and develop my thinking here with reference to the work of Walter Benjamin, the German cultural critic, philosopher, and essayist. In his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, Benjamin discusses a shift in perception that emerged after the advent of film, photography, and radio in the 20th century. He argues the capacity for easy production and transport of multiple prints of an image via mechanical technologies diminishes or even destroys what he calls the aura that once belonged to traditional forms of art. Now, unlike the postcard or the photograph, the original work of art, thinks Benjamin, had a unique physical presence in space and time, an aura or presence signaling its origins in ritual and religion. And it's this unique presence that evokes an attitude of reverence or even awe in the viewer. Although we might have a kind of intuitive grasp of what's meant by aura, I think it's a very difficult word to define. Benjamin tells us it's constituted by a certain quality of distance or remoteness. What is aura actually, he asks? A strange weave of space and time, the unique appearance of semblance of distance, no matter how close the object may be, while resting on a summer's noon, to trace a range of mountains on the horizon or a branch which casts its shadow on the observer until the moment or the hour becomes part of their appearance. This is what it means to breathe the aura of those mountains or that branch. So the example of aura in nature is used here to illuminate something about aura in art. But the definition of aura as a strange weave of space and time suggests it's not so much concerned with what we can see or the content of our experience, but rather with the very structural form of experience itself. In fact, what makes auratic experience distinct from other forms of experience is that it announces a different order of reality. In its strange weave, we become so absorbed in the object of our interest that the unique moment or the hour becomes identified with the object of our interest and included within our reverie. But just as we're drawn so close to the object as to become immersed within its temporal orbit, so too we're kept apart from the object by a unique appearance of semblance of distance. The object remains paradoxically unapproachable, despite our utter absorption within it. And in this heightened state of perception, Benjamin seems to be saying that we come up against the limits of what we can know of the object. We discern its inherent opacity, its enigmatic core. We're party to a kind of inner private experience of the object that transcends our habitual ways of understanding and responding to the world. So it might seem as if Benjamin's main interest lies in uncovering the links between aesthetic perception, artistic creation, and the techniques of production and reproduction of artworks. But his idea of aura is rather more politically charged than this. Writing in the 1930s and critical of the emergence of fascism in Europe, Benjamin saw aura as a kind of cult value that attached to objects that were owned and controlled by the elite. In this way, auras served to maintain the authority of particular cultural objects and precluded a more democratic political consciousness. So the introduction of new reproductive technologies not only brought art to the masses, it inevitably sponsored a decline in aura that weakened the authority of the elite. A new social consciousness went hand in hand with the liberation of art for political purposes and emancipatory ends. Now, today, of course, we can see how the colossal acceleration in new forms of reproductive technology speaks to precisely the kind of change in consciousness that Benjamin thought contributed to the waning of aura. The social basis of the aura's present decay, he suggests, rests on two circumstances, namely the desire of the present-day masses to get closer to things and their equally passionate concern for overcoming each thing's uniqueness by assimilating it as a reproduction. These days, I think we're all aware how contemporary digital technologies have changed the way we participate in the world. Thanks to Facebook, YouTube, Skype, Zoom, Instagram, Snapchat, and selfies, we can summon and reproduce literally millions of images by touching, swiping, saving, and liking 1 minute, and by deleting them all the next. We can instantaneously place a live image of ourselves in multiple simultaneous locations that our physical embodied selves cannot possibly reach. We're available to everyone, everywhere, all at the same time, all at the click of a button. And this capacity to distribute objects and ourselves to multiple sites and locations certainly brings us closer to other people. A cathedral quits its site, says Benjamin, to find a welcome in the studio of an art lover. A choral work performed in a hall or in the open air can be heard in a room. But this very proximity, he suggests, extracts sameness from what is unique. It serves to collapse the sense of distance that's crucial for the maintenance of aura. I wonder if something similar is taking place in our online work. I recently had the rather disconcerting experience of working with a client who, during her online session, conducted via her mobile phone, suddenly picked me up and transported me to her kitchen. I was carefully placed on the kitchen counter to provide therapy while she started to cook the evening meal. And in this rather bizarre situation, I clearly quit not just a physical site, but a psychological one as well. At the time, I remember feeling really quite angry, baffled and helpless, and it was difficult to understand exactly what was happening. But subsequently, I thought of my discomfort as a response to a particular way of relating that I think has become normalized as a consequence of our digital technologies. Benjamin offers us another useful way for thinking about this. He compares how a painter and a cameraman each go about creating images using the analogy of how a magician and a surgeon each go about the work of healing. The magician, suggests Benjamin, heals someone by a laying on of hands that respects the natural distance between himself and his subject. The surgeon, however, does the reverse. He heals someone by cutting into his flesh, an operation that significantly disregards the distance between himself and his subject. In short, he writes, the surgeon abstains at the crucial moment from facing his invalid person to person, invading him surgically instead. Benjamin's striking image here offers us a way of thinking about how aura might carry certain implications for how we relate to one another. For magician and surgeon, he writes, act like painter and cameraman. The painter, while working, observes a natural distance from the subject. The cameraman, on the other hand, penetrates deep into the subject's tissue and the images they both come up with are enormously different. And I think this difference is precisely what's really important for Benjamin. What's at stake is not whether the object, the painting, the photograph, or anything else possesses aura, but rather whether we ourselves are capable of a particular mode of experiencing, one that's able to perceive the uniqueness and singularity of the object, one that's capable of facing someone person to person. So we might say, on the kitchen counter, I've stopped being a therapist or even a person, and I've become an object of convenience. Even as Benjamin welcomes the decline of aura and the liberation of art for radical political purposes, he also mourns its fading as something that has implications for the way we relate to one another. And I think his ambivalence here speaks to us as practitioners who may be equally conflicting about the value of working online. And I want to suggest this sense of conflict that many of us experience marks the site of ethical issues that might be at stake here. For if new forms of technology once liberated art from the shackles of tradition, making it accessible to the masses and available for new kinds of political engagement, then online platforms like Skype and Zoom can similarly be thought of as liberating therapy from its elitist traditions and associations. In this mode, online therapy seems to offer us a new progressive way to relate to one another, one that no longer needs to conform to the authoritarian rules laid down by history and precedent, one that's no longer constrained by the boundaries of time and place. Now we can jettison the restrictions of the therapeutic frame. We can throw our couches away. Digital therapy is therapy that's available to all, anytime, anywhere. And indeed, state-sponsored mental health services increasingly promise not simply improved access to psychological therapy, but rather mass access, the kind that inevitably entails significant changes to the way we think about and conduct our therapeutic relationships. But if, as Benjamin suggests, the capacity of online therapy to get closer to people forecloses the possibility of aura, then maybe the traditions and rituals associated with face-to-face work can be seen as a way of deliberately cultivating something that is akin to aura. And I think this is most evident in forms of therapy that are predicated on a certain semblance of distance. And psychoanalysis is an obvious example here. But I think it occurs to some degree in most, if not all, forms of in-depth relating and practice. And perhaps the question for us to think about here is whether the maintenance of an appearance of distance, as in face-to-face therapy, is merely a form of mystique promoted in order to keep us in the grip of an elite professional group, or whether this kind of distance is somehow integral to the entire notion of therapy itself. Certainly, in psychoanalytic work, the physical setting of therapy, the constancy of the frame, and the analyst's own qualities of anonymity and absence are all seen as central to providing a safe space where the patient's unconscious material can be given priority. These features of face-to-face work are all significant ways in which a respect for the patient's own distance from himself, his opacity or otherness, is acknowledged, cultivated, and sustained. Freud, of course, came to see this otherness as constitutive of our primary relationality. The residue of the lost, loved other within is not only the basis of melancholia, it's the basis of an alterity that beats at the heart of the ego itself. Maintaining a semblance of distance, no matter how close the other may be, would seem then to signify respect for this alterity and for a particular mode of experiencing that's required in order to perceive it. By contrast, I think online work aims to cultivate and sustain a semblance of proximity no matter how far away the other may be. This means however good the technology, no matter how sharp the picture or fast the broadband, our mode of experiencing will necessarily be one in which that semblance of distance is deliberately minimized. Online work takes what's other or unapproachable and insists on bringing it up as close as possible. But it seems the price we pay for this might be a reduction in our ability to register alterity, to perceive the other's distance from him or herself. And perhaps this is how technology acts to alter not only our therapeutic sensibilities, but the very ontology of how we relate to one another. We might say in face-to-face work, the patient's embodied physical presence denotes an otherness that overflows or exceeds the bounds of the person who's sitting in front of us. Whereas in online work, the image of the patient on our computer screen denotes an absence of alterity that diminishes or lessens the actual person with whom we're working. In a world that promises or even mandates instant communication, I think it's become increasingly difficult to remember, retain, and respect that semblance of distance necessary for us to sustain an awareness of otherness. And perhaps the loss of aura, like Forster's imponderable bloom, has itself gone astray, swept aside by the rapid proliferation of digital forms of therapy, their dissociation from the fabric of history and tradition, and the promise and plenitude of something that's available to anyone, anytime, anywhere. Indeed, we might see in this endless accessibility a manic attempt to defray the very loss of aura on which virtual communication is founded. But here's the paradox. Even as online work acts to dissolve the aura of the face-to-face meeting, it simultaneously elicits a quest for presence and immediacy. The glut of online communication seems only to increase our appetite for engaging with the real. It's almost as if our new digital technologies retroactively sponsor a feeling of loss we didn't know we felt, a desire to recover something whose loss we can only construct after the event of its passing. And in a culture saturated with reproductive digital technologies, privileging proximity and sameness over distance and difference, perhaps it's only now we can begin to sense the loss of aura, the decay of our capacity to acknowledge, experience, and respect the enigmatic alterity of the other, the aura of a shared, embodied physical presence. In today's world, we tend to think of loss as something we need to get over. We should be getting on with life, with new pursuits, new relationships, and new ways of doing things. And indeed, the move to digital platforms continues apace in the public sector. And there will be many who will claim that any reduction in the availability of face-to-face practice will be more than compensated for by the benefits of an exponential increase in access to its virtual equivalent. Surely then, it's only sensible for us to embrace the opportunities afforded by online work, particularly as the current need for therapy and other kinds of helping work is so urgent. I'm not so sure, we've probably gathered that by now. I think it might be important to stay with and think about what we're losing in the current stampede for the digitization of care. This is not so much a matter of nostalgically thinking back to the good old days before online therapy, nor of desperately trying to revive outmoded forms of practice that in any case needed careful rethinking in the light of contemporary concerns. I think we must stay with the feeling of loss if we're not to lose the loss itself, if we're not to lose what is in the loss. I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling acutely the loss of my clients' physical presence, the impact of their voices, their faces, their body language, even their smell. I feel the loss of the fullness and nuance of non-verbal communication. I feel the loss of silence and stillness in the work. And above all, I feel the loss of a way of relating that cultivates a semblance of distance, a sensitivity to otherness. The extent to which we feel the loss of these things is a measure of their value. Both Benjamin and Freud remind us that there's meaning in loss, in that which always remains at a distance and which can never be retrieved. Both are interested in how thought or consciousness arises from loss, and how loss becomes the condition of a new kind of agency, one that's founded upon and haunted by a past that continues to animate the present. Both in different ways are concerned with how we can redeem loss, not by trying to bring something back or reversing what's happened, but by articulating and presenting the loss as fully as possible. For both, the expression of loss is productive of new meanings and new possibilities. I'm almost finished now. We can't yet know what new possibilities will emerge as a consequence of the pandemic and the associated acceleration of digital technologies. But one thing is for sure, in the therapeutic field, we can see significant tensions building between a vastly expanded digital sector that promises therapy for all on the one hand, and an increasingly hierarchical distribution of mental health services on the other. A disparity is beginning to develop. There will be those who have access to the presence of a practitioner and those whose experience will be mediated by technology. Many, of course, will accept the latter as good enough for all practical purposes. As Forster reminds us rather dryly, something good enough had long since been accepted by our race. One problem is that the arrival and proliferation of technology in our neoliberal market for care has changed the parameters of our social consciousness. Our horizons have already been set, shaped in such a way as to position us as consumers ready and willing to accept forms of care that are convenient to the needs of the current political system. So perhaps it's all the more urgent then to think about the consequences to us of the widespread availability of therapies and other caring practices that are predicated on a diminution of otherness, that rule out in advance that strange weave of space and time on which aura depends, and that preclude the imponderable bloom of the face-to-face encounter. I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thank you all for listening.
Rosie, thank you very much indeed. I don't feel imponderable gloom after your talk. Far from. Thank you very much. I'm just wondering if we might see if we could explore a little bit the ideas that you're speaking of, and then we could, in a few minutes, I don't know how long on that, and then perhaps we could go into our breakout rooms to talk more about our experiences, and then come back and we wouldn't have the recording on and stuff like that, so we perhaps could talk more easily. But if that's okay with people, we'll just give it a try. Perhaps we could ask people to comment, ask Rosie to clarify or whatever, the things that she's so well introduced to us. Janice, go ahead. You need your microphone on.
Right, can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Right, when you were talking about aura, I kept thinking about the transitional space. Would you say that's the same, or because that's what feels lost to me on the internet, that everything feels flat and there's that in-between space has gone somehow, and it doesn't feel as alive anymore. It feels a bit dead, really, for me, I think.
Yes, I think that's a good. I don't know whether it maps exactly onto transitional space, but I'm sure that a sort of a transitional space is one in which there's a play, isn't there? There's a play going on, and between illusion and reality, if you like, and that requires, if we're looking at it through that lens, that requires a very acute sensitivity to otherness. So I think that's very acute what you say there. There's an overlap somewhere that perhaps has yet to be fully explicated.
Yeah, it feels like that's very much lost. And my doctor sent me a joke about a Zoom meeting with a picture of a seance, and they're saying, hello, is anyone there? And it felt really apt, because a seance is a dead thing, isn't it? And I think that's why we're all working so hard online to keep something alive, and that's why it's much more exhausting, I think.
Well, a seance is a wonderful analogy, because a seance is sort of, it's about trying to bring the dead to life.
Yes.
Bringing them back, you know. So I think that's a wonderful metaphor, really, for online work.
Some other thoughts, questions, please. Just don't wait for me to call your name. Just speak, please.
Rosie. Oh, sorry.
You go.
No, go ahead, Sasha.
Just a few words. Pretty much a comment, Rosie. It feels quite powerful when you were talking about your experience being in your client's kitchen table, and I kind of like really kind of almost had that image of not necessarily you, but kind of like there's something about shrunken therapist, or therapist reduced to the kind of like some kind of app of convenience. So I thought I'll just bring it up.
I think that's, you know, that's really interesting. I do remember it happened not long ago, and I remember it's a bit like, I don't know if people remember, you know, what it's like to be a toddler or a child, and, you know, an adult picks you up and takes you somewhere, and you have no say, you know, you're in a furious rage or something, and your dad picks you up and plonks you somewhere, and you're kicking and shouting and yelling and helpless. And I must say, I felt a bit like that. I didn't know what was happening. Suddenly, the screen in front of me was sort of swinging around, and I found myself parked next to a whisk and a bowl, and you know, I mean, it was just mad. And I could see that I'd become something I wasn't. And I was fulfilling quite a different function, and my own sort of function and role had been completely blown.
Almost like a metaphor of a mental health you're talking about, yeah, kind of the new emerging online mental health services, yeah. Something kind of reduced.
Yes.
To that kind of like level.
Well, I mean, I see it like that. I'm very aware not everybody does.
I just resonated.
But I think that yes, I see all this coming up close and being able to be anywhere. There's a cost to that, and oddly, it seems to reduce us rather than, it makes us less than what we are rather than more than what we are, if you see what I mean.
When you told that, you know, when you expressed about moving you from place to place and swinging about, I was thinking to myself, we seem to be really working hard to keep boundaries whether it's, you know, the space, the time, even though we may set it out for the client, perhaps at each session, and we have so-and-so, and then coming towards the end and saying the end. But there are some people that can't seem to seem to listen to what we want. You know, we've got boundaries, we have to finish here now. It's hard. I found some of my clients are very hard work to keep them in, right, we must finish now, but they're like steamrollers talking. Sorry?
I was just wondering if there might be at the other end of the spectrum. I had a similar experience to yours, Rosie, but in a positive way. A client I was speaking to, we'd been speaking she had been in her bedroom, and, you know, you're invited into quite an intimate space. And there was something about being invited in there. And at one point, she was worried she might be overheard by somebody else in the house. And she took me with her into her little dressing room. And we sat down on the floor in her dressing room, and she was holding me up really close to her face, not quite whispering, but speaking in quite an intimate way that actually brought me in a lot closer, in a way, than otherwise would have been possible. And I think there is absolutely something about the loss of control of the boundary of the environment, that there is something absolutely around that loss. But I wonder if there are losses, but somehow whether there might also be some additional things that are possible.
Gains.
Don't know.
I suppose there are some additional things that can be analysed, aren't there? Like, what does it mean to be put on the kitchen counter or to be moved and brought closer? I suppose it can be analysed as what they're doing with the frame.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about being put on the kitchen counter is perhaps how furious the client is that she's online, or perhaps, you know, you're like, you become like one of the saucepans on the side.
That's certainly what I felt like.
Yeah.
It reminds me a bit of the vaccination, and that we're reaching more people, but we're maybe less effective. We're all 50% rather than 70 or something. Don't know. I think there's a parallel.
I thought so much, Rosie. Thanks for a really some wonderfully evocative half an hour. But I'm reading a rather beautiful memoir at the moment by an artist called Samantha Clark, and it's called The Clearing. And it's about clearing her parents' house after their deaths. And her mother she's an artist and writer, and her mother was profoundly ill nearly her whole life. She was really kind of failed by the mental health services in so many ways, and was just a retreated person. But for Samantha, gaps are what have always spoken to her in some ways. So she's very interested in cosmology, and she talks a lot about the fact that we see stars, but actually what holds the cosmos together is the dark matter that you can't get at, and that neither should you, that to some degree, but that the acknowledgement that it's there, and that you might sit with gaps. And that spoke very much to me around trying to think about aura and alterity and loss, really. And yes, I think my experience of practice feels very resonant with a lot of that.
Thank you, Lorna. Do you think you're saying that there's something about face-to-face work that allows for a gap in a way that online work doesn't?
Allows for a gap, and perhaps for the presence of dark matter. That perhaps on online work we only see the star,
Mm.
You know, to some degree, the brightness of it and the kind of what's available, and the nuance of gaps and distance seems important.
And absence, of
And
course.
absence, yeah.
Because we get very kind of fixated. I mean, like now, you know, I'm glued to the visual, the image, what I can see of you all.
Mm.
And how hard silence might be, that it takes on a different quality, at least my experience of that it can feel much more kind of persecutory in some way, or maybe I feel persecuted by it and I find myself filling in the silences more. But, you know, that might not be everyone's experience, obviously.
I think silence has a very different quality online.
Mm. Mm.
Very different.
But I think there can be a gain there as well. I think maybe what Anne was saying previously, you know, maybe I talk for myself, but I think what you're saying is so important with regard to what's been lost and the aura that's been lost. But I found in working online, something had been gained, an aura had been gained. There was something else that I think for so long I've been working psychoanalytically, and I normally work more than 2 meters away from the patient client. And somehow there was suddenly this more equal relationship with its pluses and minuses. And one of them was there's something we say about the alterity that I think I felt something else that was beneficial in our exchanges, which I didn't have when there was more of a distance, and I worked in a different way.
Can you articulate that, Del? What do you think you're saying?
I felt there were two people in the room more, rather than the therapist and the client or patient, I suppose. There was that. I think I got used to working with silence. It was different, but I felt that there was a meeting, and I experienced something else of the person, something radiated from them through the screen. Yeah. In a way that, well, just talking with you now. Yeah. We're talking much closer to each other than we normally would, even though we worked in the same offices and things, in a sense. You know, there's a feeling in which I experience something else from you now that I wouldn't in the face-to-face. Now, a lot is lost, and I don't want to take away from what you said there. I think it's absolutely vital. But I also felt something, I gained something of the persona, something of being with somebody by being closer to them, which I don't work in that way normally, and I don't think I will necessarily in future. But I did think there's something of, you use the word alterity, something of an otherness, of being closer.
I think that's one of the difficulties, isn't it? Because I think that in some ways working online, I think as you've said, Del and Anne, one of the questions is about what it means to be close to someone. And I think there is something about, if you're speaking to someone on the phone, or even, you know, sitting right close up and talking to them about something on Zoom, there can be some sort of, maybe it's a semblance of closeness. But I think it's possible to be in the same room with them and feel more distant. But I wonder whether or not there is something in, maybe I'm making the distinction too simply, but there is something, isn't there, about the difference between, I don't know, or, as you say, reverence, and the idea that that the therapist is someone who can be possessed, as it were, or the client. I don't know. The difference between having the image, and on the other hand, there's something about a kind of a reverence for the image. I don't know, something like that.
Oh, say a bit more, Onel.
Well, I guess I'm thinking that what you've been saying about online work, I think absolutely, and there is something there which might well be fitted into this idea that what we are good at is possessing. That's what we do most of the times. We, you know, so the person doesn't go to see you and sit in the room and there are two human beings and you have, you know, feelings about each other, sort of, you know, all sorts of complicated things about each other. She's got you on her phone. She's as a possession. She takes you into the kitchen, puts you where she wants you, and gets on with her life. And I guess I'm trying to say something about the difference between something that might be more reverent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, I didn't stress this, but I believe Benjamin's idea of aura in art is predicated on the idea of art's origins in the sacred.
Yes.
And it, I know that's not a very fashionable idea in therapy these days, and particularly as we sort of like to think about what Del was talking about earlier, about a sort of mutuality, or, you know, there's a more equal relationship. So how does sacred fit into that, for God's sake? But that's a complicated one. But I think reverence for the otherness of the other, whether we're the therapist or the patient, is crucial. And I think that's what aura speaks to, is that quality of reverence or awe in the face of the other. I think is in, and well, I mean, we can argue the toss with Del. Del might feel that's possible in online work. I'm not so sure. I don't know.
Well, as you've kindly handed over to me, Rosie, I'm just wondering if this would be a moment for us to spend sort of 20 minutes in some smaller groups that we could perhaps talk about our experiences and then come back and continue the conversation, if that would be all right. So I'd suggest that we've got, well, if we sort of have 5 groups, something like that, see who comes along and takes part in that, and then we'll return in 20 minutes time to a plenary session. But if that's okay with everyone. Yep, I saw somebody's hand up with a thumb. Great, thank you.
You can call us back, Del. You can call us back anytime you want.
Okay, well, let's do that in it's something like past. And thank you so much, Rosie, for getting us into this conversation. But thank you so much for your amazing abilities to articulate so much with regard to your sense of what's been lost and the kind of situation we've found ourselves in now that we're still trying to. But I think you've helped us so much to get in touch with what indeed has been lost. Thank you very much. Can we all give Rosie a put your microphone?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to see you all.